You actually went to law school? Caroline cocked her head slightly, wearing that casual, teasing smile. Because, to be honest, you sound more like TikTok than someone prepping for the bar. That one landed. A laugh burst out from somewhere in the middle rows, and from the far right corner of the stage came a long, drawn-out, the kind people make when someone throws a jab that's playful but still cuts deep. The host, Ryden, tried to keep things steady, though you could see him glance at Jasmine Crockett to gauge her reaction. But Jasmine? She gave him nothing. No smirk. No eye roll. Not even a blink until, after a moment, she did blink. Just once. Real slow. Real silent. Camera 2 picked up on it right away and started to zoom in for a reaction shot, but the director wasn't having it. He waved for a different angle. So camera 3 switched things up and pointed away from the stage entirely, shooting straight down the center aisle toward the back of the room. That's where she was. Back row. A young black girl, maybe 19 or 20, sitting up perfectly straight like she'd practiced it. Her hair was up in a clean, high bun and she wore a crisp white blouse. Her hands were clasped tight in front of her. She didn't crack a smile, didn't look away. Her eyes locked on Jasmine and didn't budge. She wasn't anyone listed on the program. Not a speaker. Not part of the panel. Just another guest in the crowd. But the way she looked, so focused, so still, it made the camera guy hesitate and hold the shot just a little longer. Caroline didn't see any of it. She kept grinning, still pleased with her little punchline. Most of the audience was still reacting like they'd just heard a well-timed joke. But a few folks, the ones seated near camera 3, started to glance back, their expressions shifting slightly, like they were starting to wonder, wait, who is that girl? Have you ever had people judge you just for how you talk? Maybe your words weren't polished enough, or your tone didn't match what they expected, like your voice alone made them assume what you knew or didn't know. Where are you tuning in from right now? And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that question, what school did you go to? Not because they care, but because they already think they know the answer. Just drop a period in the comments so we know you're with us. The space was called Studio G, kind of sleek, kind of tight. Room for about 60 people, all curved around a small stage that sat low to the ground. The stage was covered in gray carpet, with 2 charcoal leather chairs facing each other and a round glass table in between. Lighting was soft but sharp, 3 sources, angled just right. The name of the show? Voice of Power. The question of the day: what exactly is intelligence, and who gets to decide what counts? Mark Miller was running the conversation, a seasoned host who'd spent years interviewing folks on both sides of power. He didn't like stirring the pot too hard, but he knew how to keep the heat at just the right level to keep folks in their seats. Caroline Levitt was the first to be introduced. She walked out wearing a navy blazer, her hair straightened and tucked neatly behind her ears, her expression wide open, no walls up. She nailed her opening. Hit every note like a pro. The tone, the pace, all of it landed well. A few younger folks in the crowd nodded like, yep, she's got stage presence. Ryden gave her a solid intro, former White House spokesperson, someone who stood toe-to-toe with scholars and held her own. The applause was right on time. Not over the top, but respectful. Then it was Jasmine's turn. She didn't walk out in some stiff office uniform. She had on a simple black outfit, low heels, and barely a trace of makeup. Just herself. And even though she didn't say a word right away, the room felt different the second she stepped in. It wasn't that she smiled. It was that she looked everyone in the eye and didn't flinch or dodge a single gaze. Ryden gestured for her to take her seat, then gave her intro, lawyer, congresswoman, and, as reporters like to say, a voice for the communities nobody hands a microphone to. The applause came again, but softer. Still, a few clapped longer, like they knew what she represented. Caroline gave Jasmine a look, not rude, just calculating. Like she was sizing her up. The way seasoned professionals sometimes do, as if the way someone sits down tells you everything about their mind. Then Ryden launched into his first real question. When it comes to education, he asked, is it about credentials, the way we speak, or how we follow through? Caroline jumped in first. Her answer was sharp and methodical. For me, education isn't about your roots, she said. It's about being able to speak in any room without leaning on emotion to make your point. She paused before her next thought, as if to let it sink in. I've worked with people who didn't go to Ivy League schools, but when they opened their mouths, nobody questioned their credibility. Then Ryden turned to Jasmine. I think education shouldn't be a wall of words people have to climb over, she said. It should be a bridge, something built from real experience. Ryden gave her a nod, waiting for more. But before she could continue, Caroline slid in with a half-laugh. You sound like one of those motivational quotes. A few folks chuckled. Others, mostly older ones, shrugged like they'd heard worse. One young person in the front looked down at their shoes and gave a soft smile, unsure whether to laugh or cringe. Then Ryden brought up a stat. Based on current numbers, about 27% of Black Americans have a bachelor's degree or higher. But when it comes to being featured on panels like this one, they show up only about 8% of the time. What does that tell us about who gets to define intelligence in this country? Caroline answered with a knowing smile. I think the line between personal experience and actual knowledge is getting blurry, she said. We can't let social media-style language take over academic spaces where shouting the loudest is mistaken for being right. That comment had more bite, and it was clear who it was aimed at. Still, she worded it just carefully enough to deny intent if called on it. Jasmine didn't bat an eye. She just tilted her head slightly, like someone who's heard this 100 times before and was waiting to see what else would be said. Ryden kept moving things forward. The crowd was still tuned in, but something was shifting, not discomfort, exactly, just a kind of tension settling over the room. Caroline added one more thought. I respect lived experience, I really do, she said. But when you speak on behalf of an entire community and it sounds like an Instagram live stream, I worry we're twisting the word intellectual out of shape. That last line? It wasn't loud, but it landed with weight, like a marble that slips off a glass shelf and clicks against tile. Small sound, but sharp enough to echo. Ryden turned to Jasmine. She didn't say anything, just lowered her eyes to her palms, pressed her lips together, and then slowly looked back up. No anger, no pushback, just that quiet, steady look, the kind you give when you've been here before and you know exactly what's coming next. The camera swept gently across the audience, gliding like it had all the time in the world. That young Black student from earlier? Still in her seat. Same upright posture. Same locked-in expression. She reached into a small canvas pouch resting quietly in her lap. Barely moved, no fuss, no fidgeting. Just pulled out a folded piece of paper and set it on the chair next to her like it meant something. It was a simple sheet folded once down the center, clean, with a small diagonal rip in the lower left corner. Probably torn carefully from a notebook. She didn't look around. Didn't check the lens. Didn't break her focus. Her eyes stayed fixed on Jasmine. Nobody in the studio caught it. Not yet, anyway. But camera 3 stayed on her like it knew something was happening, something that hadn't made itself clear just yet. And anyone watching the replay? They'd know. That was the moment something quietly shifted. Mark Miller glanced at the small digital clock beside his chair and subtly adjusted his mic. He knew what time it was, minute 6, maybe creeping into 7. That was the danger zone for live shows. If you didn't hold people's attention by then, they'd start reaching for their phones. He looked over at Jasmine. Miss Crockett, he said, when you talk about education as a bridge of experience, have you ever been told you sound emotional? Like you're preaching instead of being academic? Jasmine didn't hesitate. Oh, plenty of times, she said, nodding. Usually from folks who act like knowledge is something only they get to hand out. That earned a few light laughs from the crowd. Not a roar, more of an understanding chuckle. The kind people make when someone just said something that resonates. Caroline straightened up in her seat. smiling like she'd been waiting for this setup all along. "Well then," she said, keeping her tone light, "could you share your definition of critical thinking? The one you use when you teach your community." Ryden gave her a quick side-eye. He didn't say anything, but it was clear he wasn't expecting her to jump the tone that fast. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't flinch, just answered. "Critical thinking," she said, "is being willing to question even the beliefs you love most." Several people in the crowd nodded. You could feel that line settle. Caroline flipped her palms upward with a shrug. "Cute," she said. "Sounds like something I'd see on Instagram Monday morning." It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make a man in the middle row turn his head, not toward Caroline, just off-center, like he could feel something going sideways. Ryden jumped in to keep the energy moving. "Miss Levitt," he said, "you've mentioned before that some modern community activists use the word education to cover for a lack of structure in their thinking. Could you expand on that?" Caroline leaned forward, not missing a beat. "Sure. I didn't say they're ignorant," she said. "I said they're skilled at stirring emotions. But when you ask them to think within a logical framework, they fall back on anecdotes." Jasmine tilted her head slightly. She didn't react, just gave that patient look. The kind where you let someone set their own trap. Caroline glanced at her again, then pushed forward. "For example," she said, "could you explain the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning?" A soft ripple moved through the room, that low ooh sound people make when they recognize a test being slipped into a conversation. Ryden turned his eyes to Jasmine. She didn't blink. She didn't sidestep. "Deductive reasoning moves from general rules to specific conclusions," she said. "Inductive looks at specific observations and builds toward a general idea." Then she paused, just long enough to let the next part come up from deep inside. "But if you think education ends with naming definitions," she added, "then you've never sat in a classroom where a student goes quiet because they can't afford the textbook." That hit different. The words weren't shouted, but they rose from the gut, through the chest, and landed right where they needed to. Back row. That girl. She hadn't moved all this time, but now her hands tensed just slightly, as if what she heard had once been her own story. Caroline pressed her lips into a smirk. "So, instead of answering directly," she said, "you turned it into a story." Jasmine nodded, calm as ever. "I told a story," she said, "because where I come from, stories are the only thing no one corrects for grammar." Someone in the third row let out a short laugh, almost a ha, soft but clear. And just like that, Caroline realized something had shifted. The room wasn't leaning her way anymore. Ryden opened up a quick segment. "In a recent poll," he said, 62% of young people said they feel underestimated when talking about politics. Why? Because their words don't sound standard. He read the quote slowly. "They said, I may not say it right, but that doesn't mean I don't have something to say." He turned toward Jasmine. "Have you ever felt that?" Jasmine looked him straight in the eye. "There was a teacher once," she said, "who made me read out loud every word, line by line. And when I got one wrong, he didn't correct me." She paused just for a beat. "He'd ask, 'Do you understand what you just read?' If I said yes, he'd say, 'Then you don't need to read it again.'" The whole room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that happens when folks lose interest. This was the stillness that falls when something honest is laid bare. Caroline wasn't looking at Jasmine anymore. Now her eyes flicked to Ryden, then to the cameras. And then she sat up just a little straighter, like she could sense the ground shifting under her, but no one had told her out loud. Back row again. That girl leaned forward slightly. The paper in her lap was now half open. No one noticed. Not in the room, anyway. But the camera sure did. Caroline went for one last swing. "You talk about learning from life," she said. "But all I'm hearing is someone who's gotten good at retelling their pain." She paused, as if expecting to land a punch. "It moves people emotionally," she said, "but it doesn't teach them what's right or wrong." Jasmine didn't answer right away. 1 beat. 2. 3. Then, With a voice quiet but steady, she said, "You want right and wrong written on a chart. But where I grew up, it wasn't about words. It was about who stayed behind when everybody else walked away." In the room, the rows of seats remained still. The silence wasn't just about listening anymore. It was a kind of witnessing. Back row, the girl folded the paper again and rested it in her lap. Her gaze? Still locked in. But now it wasn't just watching. It was waiting. Ryden sat still for a second or two, then turned toward the main camera. "We'll take a 1-minute break," he said. The lights dimmed. Nobody moved. Nobody smiled. But by this point, nobody was keeping score anymore. This wasn't a debate, not really. You could feel it. What was happening now wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something else. Something standing up inside somebody. And the room? The room wasn't ready. The lights in the studio dimmed slightly, casting a softer tone over the stage. That kind of quiet settled in, not so long that it broke the flow, but just enough to hold everyone between two thoughts. Ryden didn't say a word. Neither did Caroline. That young black girl in the back row? Still seated. But now her hands were holding the unfolded sheet of paper, laid flat across her lap. No one was watching her, not yet. But somewhere, someone could feel something building. Jasmine was the first to speak. She didn't rush into it. Didn't jump back at Caroline. She didn't even look in her direction. She just said something that no one expected. "I used to not understand what I was saying," she began, calm and steady. "And that lasted all the way through my first 2 years of school." You could feel the whole room lean in, not physically, but mentally. Everyone just breathed in. "I could read, but I couldn't really comprehend," she said. "I memorized." I nodded a lot. I was too scared to ask again. She didn't pause to recover, she paused to let it land. "I had a teacher, a black man, older than my dad, who taught this class called Law Explained for people who still don't believe they belong in law school." A few folks let out a low laugh. Not funny, haha. The kind of laugh people make when something hits too close to home. "He didn't start with chapter 1, Jasmine said. He started by asking, 'Has anyone here ever felt like they weren't allowed to speak in class?'" She scanned the room, her eyes slow and deliberate. Nobody raised their hand. But they didn't have to. People were already looking longer at her face, holding on to her every word. "I raised my hand that day," she said. "And he didn't say I was brave. He didn't clap or say good for you." She took another pause, deeper this time. "He just asked, 'Why?'" She let that question hang. "I told him, because I thought smart people didn't need to ask again." From the center row, a woman exhaled quietly. Her partner reached over and gave a slow, silent nod. Jasmine kept going. "My professor looked at me for a long time," she said. Then he said, "The person who never asks questions is the person who stops learning." She glanced down once, just briefly. "And then he told me something I never forgot. If you pass the test without understanding it, you didn't win. You were just trained to make other people feel less bothered by your ignorance." That line sent a ripple across the room, slow and real. On the left side, heads began nodding. You could tell it wasn't intentional. It was just the kind of truth that pulls your body into agreement. Jasmine looked up again, voice steady. "From that day forward, I started asking," she said. "Even when I already thought I knew. I asked how to pronounce things. I asked what certain words meant. I asked things that I thought would embarrass me." On the host's side, Ryden tightened his grip on his notes, not because he was emotional, but because he could feel it too. This woman didn't need a spotlight to win. She didn't need a stage or applause. She was winning by saying the things so many had never dared say out loud. Even after graduating, Jasmine said, "I learned at a slower pace. I wrote slower. My words didn't always flow. But I never sat next to someone I couldn't understand. And I never made anyone feel small for not knowing." Caroline didn't say anything. No smile. No eye roll. No comeback. She just stared at the stage lights, probably wondering if the thing she laughed at earlier still felt worth it. Then Jasmine delivered her final thought, slow, strong, and without a trace of drama. I learned from someone who asked, "Do you understand?" and never asked it just to be impressed. She took one last breath before finishing. I didn't learn to compete with anyone in this room. I learned so I'd never feel lost in a room where no one stops long enough to explain things again. Camera 2 cut to the student in the back row. She was folding that note again, not to stash it away, but like she was preparing to lift it. No one expected what happened next. Not the host. Not the panel. Not anyone watching with a mic in their hand. But then, that same girl, white blouse, high bun, hands that had never left the note in her lap, stood up. No one stopped her. There was no security, no beep, no stage cue. Nothing. She stepped out from her row and walked down the center aisle. Quiet steps. Straight posture. She stopped about 5 steps from the stage, right where the light barely kissed the top of her shoulders. Ryden didn't even have time to speak. Caroline watched in silence. Jasmine looked her dead in the eye and didn't look away. The girl didn't wait for approval. She didn't check in. She just spoke. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm not on the list of speakers. But if it's all right, I'd like to read a letter, one I once wrote to Miss Jasmine Crockett." You could have heard a pin drop. Caroline leaned back slightly, her arms crossed tight. Ryden didn't move. Jasmine didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She just kept her eyes on the girl. The young woman unfolded the paper. It was soft with age, worn edges, a crease across the top corner. Purple ink. The first line had a scratch out, like maybe she'd started it wrong the first time. And then she read, not with nerves, not with confidence, just with the raw honesty of someone who once wrote something real and nearly forgot how much it meant. "Miss Jasmine," she began. "I wrote this letter at the end of March while I was working on my scholarship application." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. I didn't know how to start. Nobody in my family's ever written one of these before. The camera drifted to Caroline. Her face was blank now. No sarcasm. Just still. The girl continued. "I'm the daughter of a single mom. My mom finished the 8th grade. Growing up, people told me not to use big words, 'cause they said I was showing off." She paused, just for a breath. "But when I saw you speak online, Miss Jasmine, it was the first time I ever saw someone who sounded like my mom and was a lawyer." Jasmine closed her eyes, just for a second. Long enough that the people closest to her saw her chest rise with one soft inhale. The girl read the last part carefully. "I quoted you in my essay. I wrote, 'Education isn't about leaving where you're from. It's about learning how to return, without shame.'" Somewhere in the second row, you could hear a faint sniffle, soft enough that you couldn't tell who it came from. The girl with the letter paused for just a second. Her voice didn't waver. She stayed steady. "You probably don't remember me," she said, "but when I got the scholarship, I got a short email." She looked straight ahead as she spoke. It said, "I don't need to know your score. I just want you to remember no one is wrong for asking questions in the language their mother gave them." A man somewhere in his 50s bowed his head. He'd spoken during the Q&A part of the show earlier, but now, for the life of him, he couldn't even recall what he was going to ask. Then the student read the final line of her letter. "I just wanted to say, if anyone here thinks you don't represent real education, they should know you were the first person who made me believe I deserve to learn, without having to lower my voice or change the way I speak." The silence that followed didn't feel like a pause. It felt like everyone just knew. There was nothing else to say, and no one needed to say it. Caroline didn't bow her head. She didn't respond. Ryden brought his hands together, slow and gentle, not out of reverence exactly, but more like a reflex. Like he'd just seen something that wasn't in any rehearsal, and maybe never could be. Jasmine kept her eyes on the girl. She didn't cry. She didn't stand up or walk over. She simply pressed a hand lightly to her chest, right where you hold something important, so you don't forget it, even if you never speak it out loud. The girl folded her paper again. She didn't add anything. Didn't ask for a round of applause. Didn't even look up as she walked back to her seat, sat down and stared straight ahead. But the whole room, watched her. Not because she stood up, but because in doing so, she reminded everyone what it felt like to write something from your heart and to wonder if the person you wrote it for would ever read it. There was no viral storm after that show. No trending hashtags. No angry split-screen reaction clips. No headlines that said Caroline Leavitt destroyed in debate or Congresswoman's mic drop moment. What got shared first and spread fast was a 3-minute and 42-second video clip from camera 3. Unedited. No background music. No dramatic zooms. Just a student, standing quietly in a studio, reading a worn letter to the person who once helped her believe she belonged in the classroom, just as she was. The video got uploaded by a small account called Letters We Never Sent. By sunrise, it had been shared over 100,000 times. But the reactions weren't filled with rage. There was no outrage machine kicking up. Instead, the captions were things like, "I wish I'd written something like that to Miss Tram in 4th grade. The question that changed my life was, do you understand? I cried. Not because of her letter, but because I once wrote one just like it, then tore it up. I didn't think I was good enough to send it." In Atlanta, a middle school teacher printed the entire letter. She put a copy in every desk before her students arrived. And at the top of each one, she handwrote a line. If you've never written a letter to someone, today's a good day to start. In Fresno, a dean at a local community college saw the video. He scrapped his entire first-day curriculum. Instead, he gave students one prompt. Write to the first person who made you feel like you could learn. One student wrote about their grandmother, said she asked every morning, "Did you learn anything today?" even though she couldn't read herself. Another mentioned a bus driver who always let him sit near the front when he forgot his glasses and never said a word about it. No one brought up Jasmine Crockett's degrees after that. Nobody asked Caroline what her response was. People stopped taking sides altogether. Because of that letter, it changed the whole conversation. It moved people from who was right to something much deeper. Who taught you, without even knowing they were teaching? In California, a podcast on education launched a new series called My Teacher Didn't Have a Name Tag. They invited listeners to send in stories. Hundreds did. One elderly woman talked about a retired soldier who taught her how to count change at the corner store. A chef recalled the librarian who first encouraged him to check out a French cookbook. A woman from Minnesota wrote in about her dad. Said he never smiled much, but always asked, "Did you understand the lesson?" And not once, not one single time, did he mock her when she got it wrong. In Ohio, a public library opened an exhibit called The Letters We Never Sent. People posted notes on the walls, written by hand. To Miss Ngach, my kindergarten teacher in 1997, you didn't scold me when I said the wrong number. I've never forgotten that. To the motorbike driver back then, thanks for teaching me how to ask prices without fear. I work in sales now. To the vice principal who explained the difference between I understand and I got the answer right. I'm teaching my daughter that now. Jasmine Crockett didn't go on a press tour. She didn't give interviews. Didn't accept invites to return. Didn't tweet about the moment or repost the video. And when a journalist emailed her communications team to ask why, they got just one message back. No subject line. Just a short note. I don't need to be remembered. I just need someone to remember the first person who made them feel they were worth being taught. Caroline Leavitt didn't get dragged online. No boycott. No petitions. But something shifted. At future events where she spoke, people stopped asking about her alma mater. No one asked, "What's your educational background?" They only asked, "Who did you learn from?" And for a while, she didn't have an answer. Because that kind of thing doesn't show up on a resume. A week after the broadcast, someone posted a photo on Reddit. It was a classroom whiteboard. Across it, in big black marker, were the words, "No new lesson today. Today we're writing what we never said." Taped to the corner of that board was a printout of the letter, the one from the student on the show. At the very bottom, in a shaky handwritten note, someone had added, "I'm still learning, but I don't think I'm lacking anymore." Nobody knew who the student really was. The video account that posted the clip never gave her name. She never answered any messages, didn't go public, didn't follow up. But somehow, everybody remembered her anyway. One photo slipped out later, not from the show, not part of the broadcast. It was grainy, dim, like it had been taken without anyone meaning to capture a moment. The girl was standing next to Jasmine backstage. No hug, no tears. Just the two of them, and Jasmine handing her another piece of paper, small, folded, no fanfare. On it, only 2 lines. "This was the question I used to be afraid to ask. You just taught me how to ask it in my voice." There were no arguments after that. No spin. No post-show debate panel. Just stories. Stories started surfacing about the people who taught others to speak, to write, to ask. Not through microphones. Not through viral clips. But through a question so simple, it almost goes unnoticed. Do you understand? And that's when it really settled in for folks. Jasmine didn't win that night because she had the most education. She didn't win because she clapped back harder or had the sharper line. She won because someone, somewhere, had learned from her and never forgot it. There wasn't a standing ovation. No dramatic lighting to cue the end. No producers waving for applause. Just a room full of people who had all quietly gone through something they didn't quite know how to name. When the show wrapped, Jasmine didn't stick around. No photos, no autographs. She left the stage, walked down a quiet hallway, and stepped into the backstage room. A technician handed her something small, a folded letter tucked neatly into an unmarked envelope. She didn't have to ask where it came from. She didn't need to read it again. It was the same letter that had been read out loud just minutes earlier, only now there was one line added at the bottom. "I'm still learning, but I don't feel like I'm missing anything anymore. And if someone ever asks me, 'Who did you learn from?' I won't be afraid to answer." Jasmine folded the letter again, quietly. Didn't say a word. She slipped it into the inner pocket of her jacket, the one where she keeps things that don't need to be shown, just held. A week later, the show wasn't trending anymore. Nobody argued about who was right. But something had been left behind, and people felt it. They started pulling open drawers, digging through old school papers, looking for the letters they'd never sent. Remembering the first time someone asked them a question that made them want to understand, not just memorize. An 8th-grade girl wrote a letter to her literature teacher. She said, "You never gave out high grades, but you always asked. How did that make you feel?" I didn't get it back then. Now I do. That was learning without a lecture. A dad told his son about how he learned the alphabet in a small village school. His teacher didn't speak English, but when a kid got something wrong, she'd rest a hand on their shoulder and just nod, gently. No one started a #SupportJasmine campaign. No protests. No shouting matches. Because there was nothing to fight. She had already been defended quietly, powerfully, by the people she once made feel like they were worth learning. Mark Miller, the host, later opened up on a private podcast. Someone asked him, "Why didn't you step in when Caroline started testing Jasmine on critical thinking?" He paused, then said, "Because I did that once on a different show. And back then, I stole someone's chance to prove they didn't need to shout to be heard. This time, I stayed quiet. And I finally learned the right thing," a retired teacher from Florida wrote in after watching. She said, "I used to think I wasn't doing it right. I didn't use slides, didn't have fancy terms. I just asked my students, 'Do you understand?' That was it. And when I saw that student read her letter, I realized maybe that was the only thing I ever taught that truly mattered." And in the end, one photo started making its way around. Quietly. It wasn't a promo shot. Not a quote graphic. Just a regular photo, taken with an old phone camera. An old piece of paper, folded in thirds, laid next to a pile of beat-up textbooks in someone's drawer. No filter. No caption except, "This is the letter I almost tore up." I kept it not for praise, but to remember someone once believed I was worth teaching. So where are you watching this from? Is it a classroom? Maybe a bus ride home? Maybe it's somewhere you used to feel like you didn't belong because you didn't understand what was being said and nobody thought to slow down. If someone, at any point in your life, ever asked you, "Do you understand?" and didn't mind waiting for your answer, just leave their name, or even just an initial. Let it be a small way of saying you haven't forgotten. And if you believe that true education isn't about who explains the most, but who dares to pause and ask the quietest person if they're following, then subscribe. Stick around, because we're going to keep telling stories like this. Stories where nobody wins the argument. Only the one who stays behind to explain what's right, even if no one's waiting to hear it.